And thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest in this really wonderful work we practice and teach. In these kind of things, I always wonder where to begin, where to begin together. So I've organized myself for you, and I thought of 3 territories I'd like to, share and talk a bit about. One is the history of the work, a bit about the history and my history I think might be useful. Just to sort of to create context a bit for where we are together. And then I'd like to talk about the nature of a biodynamic approach to cranial work, which comes from the later years of the work of Dr. Sutherland, who was the original developer of the work. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about our training program, which has only taken us about 30 years to develop. And it keeps changing. I keep driving all my tutors crazy because we're going to do it this way this year. and it's the nature of the work. It keeps teaching you. A wonderful mentor in the work, Dr. Becker, who was a student of Dr. Sutherland, talked about the work being self-taught, that you deepen into the territories and it teaches you. And you know more and more. Our clients teach us, of course, but the forces of life themselves teach us and keep us present and keep us in the work and in the learning process. I'll start way back at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. There was an osteopathic student, William Garner Sutherland. How many people have heard of him? Yeah? Oh, great. So that's well known. He was an osteopath at college. Dr. Still was still teaching, amazingly, at the time. And when he was in college, he was taught that the cranial bones are fused by the time you're 20, 21, which was classically Western anatomy. Yeah. In Middle Eastern anatomy and Middle Eastern and Eastern anatomy, it was always taught that the cranial bones are not fused normally. So isn't that interesting? It was in Western physiology that it was taught that it was fused. But Sutherland couldn't understand that. How could the cranial bones be fused if you can disarticulate a skull and it comes apart? You can't disarticulate fused bones. So it didn't make sense to him. So he got very interested. Now, the context Sutherland was learning was a very biomechanical context. So when you go to classic osteopathic college, you learn biomechanics, the biomechanics of the spine. You learn flexion, extension, internal, external rotation. You learn motion testing. You learn wonderful techniques to help mobilize joints, etc. So that was the context he was in at the time. That was his learning context. He looked at these bones and he's wondering what's going on here. Why is it taught that they're fused, but here we can take them apart? It doesn't make sense to me. And he was looking at this wonderful bone, a temporal bone. How many people have seen temporal bones? Yeah, they're very beautiful. And the inside of the temporal bone has these wonderful inner bevelings. And he was looking at the temporal bone, and he says that a thought struck me. So he believed he was given a thought, a spiritual thought. And the thought you may have heard of before, it was a very strange thought. It was beveled like the gills of a fish. He was looking at the temporal bone, beveled like the gills of a fish for primary respiration. And that kind of stopped him. Primary respiration. And then he dedicated the rest of his life to understanding the nature of primary respiration. Isn't that extraordinary? He felt that was a God-given thought and his journey in life. And it was his journey in life, actually, to discover that. So then he believed, that one of the osteopathic principles is if there is motion allowable, if you restrict the motion, there'll be repercussions in the system. So form and function are not separate. Form and function are a unified field of action. So what did he do? He said, well, if these bones are really not fused, if I restrict them on myself, there will be repercussions. And he was great. He didn't want to experiment on somebody else. He wanted to have direct knowledge. I mean, how many scientists would experiment on themselves? Huh? I don't know. I'm going to take that bacteria in and see how that works on me. So he designed this helmet, and he would screw down a parietal bone, and he'd walk around, and they thought he was mad, the mad Dr. Sutherland, and he'd walk around, and he'd find repercussions, and then he'd kind of jiggle things around, and he'd screw another bone down. And finally, his wife said, "Can you stop doing this? I think you've proved enough," because he was going mad with it, So that was the start of his journey. And then he, in his listening, in his perceptual processes, he wanted to listen to the nature of the structures there. He started to sense very subtle rhythms, which he was never taught about. And he started to develop an approach and a language for what he was sensing. That was his journey. And he named the subtle motions he was sensing in the structures, in the bones, in relationship to his biomechanics. So he would sense a very subtle inner motility, which really isn't biomechanical, but he would give it biomechanical names, like flexion, extension, internal, external rotation. But in actual fact, what he was sensing was much deeper. It was a deep biodynamic organization that goes back to the embryo we were and somewhat still are in this very moment. The very forces that organized us as embryo are still organizing us now. And they're both bioelectric and deep organizational life forces within our fluids. And that's what we orient to in the work. There's been some interesting research. I'm kind of skipping ahead. I got into the work through the work of Dr. Stone, Randolph Stone. How many of you have heard of him? He was this wonderfully mad guy. He developed polarity therapy, but he was an osteopath. And he studied with Sutherland. And he had his own way of approaching this and his own language, which is really way out there and wonderful. Dr. Stone would talk about contacting the neuter essence, the essence of the life within. And he'd enter the stillness. And I got so fascinated by that I actually went to osteopathic college to figure out what is it that he's actually talking about. So I'll go back to my history in a little while. I'll go back to Sutherland. So Sutherland started to work after that. He graduated and very quietly started listening and practicing and developing techniques based on the cranial bones he was sensing. So Dr. Sutherland kept working and developing his approach, and which initially was very, very biomechanical. So he learned to motion test vertebra, to apply techniques. So he started doing the same thing to cranial bones. Initially, it was about the cranial bones. That deepened and widened to that actually the roots of the human system later. And then he started to teach people. People got interested in his work. Later, they started the Sutherland Foundation and did basic courses, and a few osteopaths were interested in his work. Yeah. And then something extraordinary happened in 1945. So here he was for many years thinking biomechanically. Yeah. Flexion, extension, applying techniques, motion testing, things like that. In 1945, he was called to the bed in the middle of the night of a man who was passing on, who was dying. The man's family was around. They were all in fear and scared, and he was in a lot of pain. They called in Dr. Sutherland. He worked with the man in the family field, which is something. You have to hold the whole family field. You can't just hold that person. It's a field. The work we do is very much field-oriented. So he settled into the field, and he worked with a particular intention to settle the man's system into stillness, into a deeper connection with deeper forces, if you like. The man was able to settle out of his pain, speak to his family, express his love. And then Sutherland says, and then as he was holding this wide perceptual field that included the family, included the wider field, I think he was holding the man's sacrum, he said, and then something happened. We entered a stillness such as I have never experienced before. Not the stopping of something, but a stillness emerging in the field. And we entered the stillness and deepened into the stillness. And if you've ever experienced that quality of stillness, where you're not in past, you're not in future, but you're in total present time, almost in the seam between past and future. Anyone ever experienced that? You deepen into the stillness, and you come out of yourself. You come out of your self-forms, your history, your fear, into a much deeper, deeper place, a place of beingness, a more essential place within all of us. So he entered that space. The whole family field entered that space. And then he says, and something extraordinary happened. He felt what he called the breath of life moving through him, moving through everyone, casting his heart open. And that's a real experience. And he felt the breath of life as a sacred form moving through the man and lifting him away in peace. And he felt the man passing. Isn't that extraordinary? And then Sutherland dropped into this whole other place in relationship to his work. In the last 10 years of his life, his language changed, his approach to the work changed. He started talking about the unerring potency of the breath of life. Let it do the work. Use no force from without whatsoever. And he meant nothing. He meant entering a state of presence in relationship to what is there and let the forces of life do the work. And so he was in a completely different place in himself. Can you imagine that? And there was a shift from him, from this biomechanical idea of motion testing to a much more primary place of forces at work within the human system. A direct relationship to the forces that organize the human system, that organize our life at a primary level, that are with us from the time of conception, from the time of our embryological formation throughout life. And that's what he started to orient to. And his language changed, and his work changed. And from that period, certain practitioners took the work out, especially a man named Roland Becker, Dr. Becker, who wrote extraordinary work in terms of this territory, and really took the work on into this area. I was very lucky when I went to osteopathic college. Part of our program was very important. We had to apprentice in an osteopathic office as part of the program. So it wasn't just going to college. You had to do an apprenticeship, because the understanding was that it's hands-on learning, direct learning. And that's really true. It's passing the knowledge on from one person to another directly. And one of the people in the office was really into cranial work. He was just trying to understand it. He had worked with Dr. Becker, and that was my initial ground, and it was quite wonderful. So from Dr. Stone, where we were way out in the stillness, to this idea of orienting to the forces at work, to something Sutherland called the fluid tide within us, to forming a direct relationship to the forces and allowing the forces to do the work, holding an awareness of what he called the inherent health of the system, holding the conditions, the suffering, the forms of history in that person in the context of the health, until it all comes into equilibrium. And the idea of dynamic equilibrium is very important in the biodynamic approach. So that's some of the early history of the work and how it came out. And many people have taken the work out in different ways. John Upledger in the 1970s was the first person to take the work out of osteopathic practice in a particular way. I think the great gift he gave is that he got people's awareness of the work into the field. I was working in England, and I had this great. I was really lucky. I had this space in London's first complementary health center. It was a great place, and there are all different practitioners there: osteopaths, massage therapists, homeopaths, herbalists. It was this great place, and we were all talking to each other as equals. Isn't that wonderful? No one was better or higher than anyone else, and we were sharing cases. It was a great place. I did a huge amount of learning there. It was really great. In 1986, an osteopathic colleague of mine, Claire Dolby, I had already started way back when teaching Dr. Stone's work. And Claire said, Franklyn, why don't you teach cranial work outside in a different way now? Why don't you bring it out into the wider field? I kind of looked at her and went, oh, I don't know. And it really was like fools rush in where wise people definitely fear to tread. Because, well, there's all sorts of levels of stuff. There's political stuff around that. There's just trying to decide what in the world are you bringing out and what form should this take. So when I finally said yes in '87, we developed something, and what I first brought out was a kind of very mixed biomechanical, biodynamic course, more biomechanical, because I thought people without that background should have that background. That was my mental set at the time. After 4 or 5 years of that, I realized it wasn't working, because people were getting too narrowed in their perception. And so we had this meeting in 1992 at the Karuna Institute, which we set up in England. It's a beautiful place to work. It's a residential training center. We're up in Dartmoor National Park, in this beautiful setting, which is very elemental. So you learn to orient to elemental forces in this incredible environment. So a plug for Karuna. So the tutors came together, 1992. Excuse me. We all sat there looking at each other, and I said, you know, we're not teaching what we're practicing. And they all went, yeah. So we decided we have to shift the curriculum. We've got to do something about this. And it took 10 years to shift the curriculum from a predominantly biomechanical orientation to a purely biodynamic orientation. In the meantime, I was teaching in the States, I was teaching in Switzerland, in Germany. Tutors from Karuna were teaching in the States, in Australia, in, again, Europe. And the intention of biodynamics began to spread. And now other people have taken the work out in their own way, in different ways. The importance is that a biodynamic approach is grounded in the perceptual awareness of the forces at work in the human system. And it's extraordinary. And it takes one deeply into yourself. And I find that for all of the students now that come into our training course, the greatest challenge isn't just learning the work, but it's about learning about ourselves in the work. Who we are, what's in the way, what my edges are, what my needs are, what my fears are, what gets in the way of me simply being present in a deeper and deeper way with another human being. What gets in the way of me really holding an empathetic field that is receptive to the nature of that other person without judgment, with complete unconditional acceptance at the level of their existence. Yeah? Can you understand me in that? And that's key. That's key. And you know, just in everyday life, you know, just me as a father, one of my important journeys as a father was being able to differentiate between the essential goodness of my child, the essential, the essence of my 2 girls as human beings, and their behavior, which might not be on, you know. So never making them wrong for who they are, but pointing out what they're doing isn't very skillful, you know. That differentiation is important in life, because we get that mixed up as human beings all the time. We make each other into terrible people. rather than looking at things we're doing which may not be very skillful or even might cause suffering. But we have to hold that clearly. Does that make sense to you? So somehow or other, I want to be in that space with my clients, with my friends, for that matter, with my family, where I can clearly be with the essence of who they are at the being level, the essence of the beingness of me and them, and also be able to differentiate, how we are in relationship. Yeah. Does that make sense? So that also takes me into how I might work with a client biodynamically. Some of the most important principles is the ability to enter a state of presence, to come out of our self forms, of my needs, and even everything I know about the work. Sutherland was beautifully clear about this. He said to his students, you must enter a receptive state where everything you know goes behind the curtain. And you're there in bare receptivity with your patient. Because that's the only way you can be present for what is going to emerge in that present moment. I'd say, and you cannot analyze or motion test for what needs to happen in that person's system. Matter of fact, that gets in the way. You have to be able to be with the forces at work and let them guide you. So the first principle of any good therapy form is for the therapist to enter a state of presence. Whether you're a biodynamic cranial person, a psychotherapist, a very good massage therapist, you want to enter that state of presence where you're receptive to the presence and needs of the other, unjudgmentally, with appropriate response in the best possible way. Yeah. So we learn to enter a state of presence. We learn to sense what Sutherland called primary respiration within our own system. That's very important. Sutherland used to say to his students, as you know from your knowledge of your own self, the tide flows within you. And then from that, you sense what he called the tide within you, primary respiration as an experience. You can then sense it more directly in another person, if you can sense it in yourself. You have that ground. So you learn that. You learn to form a relational field with the person that's negotiated. It's very subtle work. I'll tell you a funny story. In 1983, I was an osteopathic, a craniosteopathic training course, right? So I'm there. I'm with someone who's much more experienced than me. I've learned all these techniques, right? I must be cool, right? So he lies down on the table. I put my hands on him, and we settle, and he jumps off the table. He says, get out of my system. Get out of your system? I didn't even know I was in your system. So, so I said, look, your attention was right in my system. You're getting in the way. All right. So let's take a breath. And so that was a real learning for me. So I didn't even realize I was in the system. I was looking for things. Yeah, can you understand that? My mind was moving. Yeah, and that becomes a force that Sutherland called the potency of the breath of life begins to center. So my actual intention can cause that whole person's system to lock up without even realizing it. So that was a real learning. So I started to learn about fulcrums, about settling in my own midline, settling back, receiving the whole of a person's system, the whole of the tissue field and fluid field at once, and receiving, and not engaging, not invading, but letting things come to me, just as Sutherland suggested we should do. So there's this whole training, which is very much a perceptual training, where you learn to come into relationship in a negotiated way. You learn to generate an empathetic holding field, which is relationally clear, negotiated. And then a large part of the first year of the training certainly is a perceptual training, where we layer the material seminar by seminar to build up your perceptual awareness of the forces at work and the forms that takes in the human system, so you can hold a relationship to what Sutherland called primary respiration, and a relationship to the conditioned nature of that person, to the conditions present. And so you can hold both the health and the conditions and allow them all to come into what we call dynamic equilibrium, a state of balance, where potential emerges again, where the forces take over. So there's a whole layering of learning, perceptual learning, and skills. The first 3 seminars, you really don't learn to do anything. We teach very little techniques. It's about relationship and an awareness of the forces and meeting that in appropriate ways. You know, it's not about doing things to a person's system. Sometimes that's helpful, but at the depth of the work, it's about forming a relationship that allows the forces to lead you. I'll give you an example from my early experience. This is about 1984 or so. I was in this health center, and it was great. I was doing what they considered way out stuff, the energy work, cranial work. I wasn't even sure what I was doing, but I got results, right? So I got people started referring me all their difficult cases that they didn't want to deal with anymore. So it was, for like a year it was like this, quite intense. And I was seeing about 40 people a week or so, decent practice. And I was referred to me, this man was referred to me who had extreme sciatic pain. And he had it for months and months. And he had seen many, many good practitioners who I knew, And he was finally referred to me. And it was a poor guy. It was like on fire. He'd been like this for months. And he had been medicated. He had seen you imagine what kind of practitioner you could possibly see. He had seen them by that time. So he comes into my office, and I kind of realized, oh God, look at all these people he's seen. And I was quite humbled. Boy, these people weren't helping him. I don't know, how am I going to help? It was the beginning of my career, and even now I'd be humbled. Yeah, boy, what to do? So so we settled in. I listened to his system, and I realized that my first intention would be to try and do some first aid work, to create some space, to get some fluids moving, et cetera, et cetera. But I knew some of the people he saw were really good at that. So what am I going to do? So instead, I just listened, and we worked with trying to enter stillness together to get his system out of the autonomic cycling. He was cycling sympathetic charge. A lot of, his nervous system was shot. It was really sad. Well, it took about 5 or 6 sessions. We actually managed to reach stillness, and we deepened, and his autonomic nervous system started to clear in sections. It would clear, it would be stillness, it would clear, it would be stillness, and we'd settle, and he'd settle into stillness. Like, oh, wow. And for the first time, he felt a bit less pain, and that was great. And then something happened that changed my whole outlook on the work. I settled in, and there's something in the work, we talk about the physical body, the fluid body, and the tidal body. And we were very much in the fluids, in what Sutherland called the fluid tide. Just started to emerge for the first time. And I started to feel what Sutherland called the potency, or the life forces, Gesundheit, or the life forces within the fluid starting to shift and move. I sensed a shift to the mid-thoracic area. Oh, that's interesting. I would have never thought to go there. And the whole tissue field started to organize around the mid-thoracic area. So I went up there and had a listen, and I noticed things going on. And some things were happening. I didn't have a language then for it. But forces were resolving. I felt the vertebra shifting. And I felt the potency shifting again to the OA area, the occipital atlantal occipital mastoid area on the right. Well, that's interesting. I would have never thought to go there. So I listened there, and the whole shift happened. The atlas dropped, and over a number of sessions, this kept happening. And I go, oh, great! I don't know what to do. It's showing me. Wow, isn't this something? And somewhere around 3 sessions later, the motility, the inherent movement of the central nervous system started to express itself. Some shock started to clear. And then somewhere around the 4th session after that, the system started to organize around the sacroiliac area. Wow. And the whole clearing happened. The system shifted, opened, the nervous system cleared. And it was like magic. This is amazing. all I did was be present for this and be able to be with it and have a relationship to it. And just as Sutherland said, let the unerring potency do the work, my God, you know. Jesus. But my perceptual field had to be resonant with that. I had to be able to perceive what was happening. So I had to have a relationship to it. So that early experience really changed the nature of my work, as you might imagine, yeah? So a biodynamic approach very much orients to the forces at work in the human system. The forces are manifest in the embryo, organize us as embryo into form, and maintain our organization throughout life, and manifest as what Sutherland called an inherent motility, inherent motion that you can sense, which is really fluid tissue motion. And you can start to have a relationship to that fluid tissue expression of organization, both natural organization and conditioned organization. So we also hold the conditions of the person in our awareness and let the forces guide us. That can take a number of sessions. It's not always immediate. People come in these days, we're quite exhausted. Have you noticed people are very stressed out around you? They're quite exhausted. They're always running. People come into my office and they're pretty up there. You know, they're speedy. They're exhausted. So it can take 5 or 6 sessions before their system is resourced enough to settle and the forces come through. So usually the first few sessions are about resourcing and grounding and reconnecting to those deeper forces. So that's the kind of territory of the work. And in the course, in the training course, we start to layer the material. The first seminar is largely about presence, entering a state of presence, and relationship, learning to make a negotiated relationship, negotiated contact, and starting to perceive levels of primary respiration and stillness. And that's the general orientation of the first seminar. Second seminar, we start to look at how the tissues organize and express their inherent motion within that field. And by the third seminar, we start to look at the clinical processes that begin to emerge as the system deepens. So that's the kind of territory. We keep layering the particulars over the seminars. And every seminar is brought into each seminar. So it's not like you learn something and that's there. Everything is layered in. There's an approach that is from the beginning. The first thing you learn on the first day, you're still with on the last day of the training. Everything, it's very holistic in that way. I wrote the original texts in the work in 1995, 96, Craniosacral Biodynamics Volume 1 and 2. I have a new book out finally that came out this year, Foundations in Craniosacral Biodynamics Volume 1 is now out, which apparently I'm told is much better. Yes, practitioners, is that true? That's much better. And I'm working on a new Volume 2 just now with a end of January publishes deadline, which is totally worrying me. I'll get there, I'm sure. Anyway, so who am I? I don't know. It's very, I was sharing with the course. I'm in the middle of teaching a postgrad course on the viscera. And we had great conversations. And someone was sharing, I don't know how I got here. Here I am, and here I am now in this. I'm from some little town, and now I'm here. I'm doing it. Well, how did I get here? I shared, I'm this little kid from the South Bronx. How did I get here? Standing in front of you, I'm living in England. How did that happen? So, and here I am. I feel incredibly fortunate in my life. The other side of my life, I'm a psychotherapist also. In England, I helped develop and still are helping develop a mindfulness-based psychotherapy form. If you're familiar with mindfulness practice, it's exploded in the National Health Service in England. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We work with it as a psychotherapy form, and I bring that awareness of relationship into cranial work, which is very important. Because you're not just holding a physical body, you're holding a human being and the wholeness of them. with all of their needs and fears and their personality and their family and every layer of their history you're holding. And you have to be able to have, you don't have to do anything with it, but to have to be able to hold that in a way that's heartful, that's receptive, and that can be stable in the holding, that can have a sense of clarity and stability in receiving the whole of a person. Not the fact that a person has a sacroiliac pain is just the tip of the iceberg. That person is a human being with that pain in their life. And you have to hold the whole of that. And that's really, really important, very important for me. And in the training, it is very interpersonal. People learn about themselves in relationship. I think that's incredibly important in any training. One difference probably from our training to a classic osteopathic training is that it is relational. And we look at the nature of the emotional field, the relationships. We understand trauma. We have a clear trauma component built into the course, both physiologically and through verbal skills to help a person complete what's emergent. And that's really an important territory. To be able to differentiate, for instance, Gesundheit, to be able to differentiate between an emotional process that's cycling and re-traumatizing to one that's actually completing something. You really have to, and how to hold that and help the person complete both cranially and as a human being in that process. So that's part of the training.